Reinhard Heydrich chaired the Wannsee Conference, architected the Holocaust, and ruled occupied Bohemia with such brutality that he earned the name the Butcher of Prague. When Czech resistance fighters ambushed his car on a Prague street in May 1942, his death triggered one of the war's most horrific reprisals. But for his 4 children, the assassination marked only the beginning of a lifetime defined by their father's legacy. His widow Lina and the surviving children faced a shattered Europe, carrying a name that would forever be associated with mass murder and terror. Their story reveals how the children of monsters navigate a world that will never forget who their father was. May 1942. Reinhard Heydrich lay dying in a Prague hospital, sepsis spreading through his body from grenade fragments lodged deep in his tissue. The assassination attempt on May 27th had seemed to fail at first. After the initial attack, Heydrich had even stood and fired at his assailants before collapsing. He lingered for 8 days, his condition deteriorating as infection overwhelmed him. On June 4th, he died. Adolf Hitler ordered a state funeral in Berlin, the most elaborate ceremony ever held for a Nazi official. Heinrich Himmler delivered the eulogy. Hitler himself placed Heydrich's decorations on the funeral pillow. Among the mourners were Heydrich's 2 young sons, 9-year-old Klaus and 7-year-old Heider, standing beside their mother Lina as thousands looked on. The reprisals for Heydrich's death were swift and catastrophic. Nazi intelligence falsely linked the assassination to the villages of Lidice and Ležáky. Hitler ordered both communities obliterated. All men and boys over 14 in Lidice were executed. The women were sent to concentration camps. Children deemed suitable for Germanization were handed to SS families. The rest, 81 in total, were murdered in gas vans at Chełmno extermination camp. The village itself was burned building by building, then leveled with explosives until not a trace remained. Grain was planted over the flattened earth. The name Lidice was erased from German maps. At least 1,300 Czechs died in the broader reprisals. Operation Reinhardt, the code name for the establishment of the Treblinka, Sobibor, and Beložec death camps, was named in Heydrich's honor, accelerating the machinery of genocide he had set in motion. For Lina Heydrich, widowed at 31 with 4 children, Hitler showed unexpected generosity born from respect for her husband's service. He gifted the family the lower castle at Panenské Břežany, known by its German name Jungfernbrechen, a 32-room country estate in rural Bohemia. This property had been confiscated from Ferdinand Bloch-Bauer, a Jewish sugar industry magnate who fled to Switzerland. Himmler, who assumed the role of Lina's legal guardian, arranged for approximately 30 Jewish forced laborers to work the estate. According to Postwar testimony from survivors, Lina physically abused these workers, continuing the brutality her husband had institutionalized. The Heydrich children grew up in this castle of stolen luxury. Klaus, born June 17, 1933, was the eldest. Heider, born December 23, 1934, followed. Their sister Silke arrived on April 9, 1939. And on July 23, 1942, 6 weeks after Reinhard's death, Lina gave birth to a 4th child, a daughter named Marta. The baby would never know her father except through stories and photographs. For Klaus and Heider, memories of their father were fresh, sharp images of a man who worked long hours but showed them affection. For Silke, he remained a dimmer figure from early childhood. For Marta, he would be entirely constructed from family mythology. Lina had met Reinhard at a rowing club ball in Kiel on December 6, 1930, when she was just 19. She had joined the Nazi Party earlier that year, influenced by her brother Hans, a member of the Sturmabteilung. She attended a rally where Hitler spoke and immediately embraced the movement. Reinhard, a naval lieutenant at the time, they announced their engagement after only 3 days. The speed caused scandal. Reinhard had been involved with another woman, the daughter of an associate of Admiral Erich Raeder. When Reinhard broke that engagement to marry Lina, a military court of honor charged him with conduct unbecoming an officer and gentleman. Raeder dismissed him from the Navy with dishonor in April 1931. The dismissal devastated Reinhard, who suddenly found himself without prospects, but Lina pushed him to consider the newly formed SS. She literally packed his suitcase and sent him to Munich when Himmler canceled their appointment at the last minute. That persistence changed history. Himmler interviewed Reinhardt and, impressed by his ideas for an intelligence service, hired him immediately to head what would become the Sicherheitsdienst, the SD. From that single meeting, Reinhardt rose to become one of the most powerful and feared men in Nazi Germany, second only to Himmler himself. Lina always claimed she knew nothing of his crimes, that his work was simply a job like any other, that he came home and was a loving husband and father. That narrative would serve her well in the years to come. Life at Jungfernbrechen seemed peaceful despite the war raging across Europe. The children played on the grounds. Lina managed the estate. But on October 24, 1943, tragedy struck the family in a way that had nothing to do with war or politics. Klaus and Heider were cycling in the courtyard of the castle. Seeing the gates to the street standing open, 10-year-old Klaus rode out onto the road. A small truck carrying a local football team back from a match came down the road and struck him. Klaus died from his injuries that afternoon. The loss devastated Lina. Of all the horrors surrounding them, this random accident felt especially cruel. She would later speak of it as one of the hardest moments of her life, harder even than losing Reinhard. As Allied armies advanced toward Czechoslovakia in the spring of 1945, Lina knew the family had to flee. The Red Army was approaching from the east, and she understood what that meant for the widow and children of the Butcher of Prague. In the final chaotic weeks of the war, she made desperate preparations. She entrusted her two eldest surviving children, Heider and Silke, to near strangers, people she believed would get them safely back to Germany. Remarkably, the children arrived safely at their grandparents' home on the island of Fehmarn in the Baltic Sea, where Lina herself had been born. Lina took the youngest daughter, Marte, and made the journey across country in a makeshift caravan, traveling through collapsing Germany to reach Fehmarn. For a time, they stopped at the home of Frieda Wolf, another Nazi widow in Rottach. By the time Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945, the Heydrich family had reassembled on Fehmarn. They were alive, together, and far from the vengeance that many believed they deserved. The island provided a measure of isolation and anonymity, though everyone locally knew who they were. Lina immediately faced questions about her future. She had no income, 4 children to support, and a name synonymous with atrocity. The Allied occupation forces set up denazification tribunals across Germany to classify citizens based on their involvement in the Nazi regime. Cases ranged from major offenders who faced prison or worse to mere followers who paid fines and moved on. When Lina's turn came, she faced potential prosecution not just in Germany but also in Czechoslovakia. The Czech Supreme Court tried her in absentia for war crimes, sentencing her to life imprisonment for her treatment of the Jewish forced laborers at Jungfernbrechen. She never served that sentence as she remained in Germany. In the German denazification proceedings, she was classified as a Mitläufer, a follower, the lowest category of offender. This designation indicated nominal or passive support for the regime without evidence of active criminal involvement. The tribunal imposed only a minor penalty, a fine of 75 Deutschmarks. No imprisonment followed, no restrictions limited her movement or employment. The leniency was striking given her husband's role and her own party membership dating back to 1929. But post-war Germany was inconsistent in its justice. Many former Nazis were quietly reintegrated, their pasts overlooked in the interest of rebuilding. The tribunal either believed Lina's claims of ignorance or simply chose not to pursue the matter vigorously. She was officially cleared and allowed to reclaim her financial assets and property on Fehmarn, which the British Army had temporarily confiscated in 1945. What Lina could not easily reclaim was income. As the widow of a high-ranking SS officer, she believed herself entitled to a pension under German law. Widows of soldiers killed in action receive substantial pensions from the state, compensation that recognized their sacrifice. But when Lina applied, the West German government declined. Officials cited Reinhard Heydrich's central role in the Holocaust, his organization of genocide, his leadership of the apparatus of terror. They argued that no one who profited from the Nazi regime could claim such benefits. Lina refused to accept this decision. She sued. Between 1956 and 1959, she fought a series of court cases against the West German government. arguing that her pension entitlement derived from her husband's death in service rather than his political actions. In 1956, a lower court ruled in her favor. The judges acknowledged Reinhardt's criminal responsibility but prioritized the statutory basis for compensation under the Bundesversorgungsgesetz, which covered widows of deceased service members regardless of regime affiliation. The government appealed. The case climbed through the judicial system, making headlines and generating outrage. Critics pointed out that Jewish widows and other Nazi victims received no such compensation, yet here was the widow of a mass murderer claiming benefits. In 1959, the Federal Social Court affirmed the lower court's decision. Lina won. She was declared entitled to a substantial pension equivalent to that of a retired minister-president, essentially the pension of a German general killed in action. The court ruled on narrow legal grounds, but the effect was devastating to public opinion. Here was justice inverted. The perpetrator's family rewarded while victims struggled. Lina would receive this pension for the rest of her life, supplementing her income and allowing her a comfortable existence. She showed no remorse, no acknowledgement that perhaps accepting such money was morally unconscionable. To her, it was simply what she was owed. With her financial situation secured, Lina ran the family property on Föhr as a small pension and restaurant called Imbria Parva. Former SS officers frequently gathered there for reunions, exchanging memories of what they called the good old days. Lina hosted them warmly, maintaining the social networks of the old regime. The guest house became an informal meeting place for unrepentant Nazis, a space where they felt safe from judgment or prosecution. Local authorities were aware but took no action. Lina raised her 3 surviving children in this environment, surrounded by people who refused to acknowledge the enormity of Nazi crimes. Heydrich, Silke, and Marta grew up on Föhr knowing they were different, marked by their surname and their father's notoriety. Unlike some children of Nazi leaders, they were not constantly in the public eye. Lina kept them out of the spotlight as much as possible, but the past was always present. Heydrich, old enough to remember living in the castle, old enough to recall his father and brother, carried memories that shaped his understanding of the world. Silke and Marta, younger, relied more on what their mother told them, the carefully constructed narrative of a father who was simply doing his duty, who loved his family, who was misunderstood by history. Lina reinforced this narrative relentlessly. In 1965, while on holiday in Finland, she met Finnish theater director Mauno Manninen. They married, primarily so that Lina could change her surname from the infamous Heydrich to the more anonymous Manninen. The marriage was practical rather than romantic, a way to move through the world with less attention. But she never stopped defending Reinhardt's reputation. She wrote letters to newspapers correcting what she saw as errors or slanders. She spoke with authors and journalists, always maintaining that her husband had been a professional security official focused on his work, not an ideological zealot bent on genocide. In February 1969, the guest house on Föhr burned down. The family lost the business, but rebuilt their lives. Lina continued operating a small boarding house on the island, maintaining her independence and her connections to the old Nazi networks. Then in 1976, she published her memoir, Leben mit einem Kriegsverbrecher, Life with a War Criminal. The title itself dripped with irony. She later claimed to regret the title because readers took it at face value, assuming she acknowledged her husband's criminality. In fact, she meant it sarcastically, a jab at those who labeled Reinhardt a criminal. The book portrayed their life together as normal, domestic, unremarkable, except for his professional success. She described his work as routine administration, paperwork, security matters. She made no meaningful acknowledgement of the Holocaust, the mass murders, the suffering he orchestrated. In interviews with American journalist Andrea Dougherty in the 1970s and early 1980s, Lina doubled down on denial. She claimed she had known nothing about extermination camps. She dismissed mass gassings as a fairy tale. She argued such operations were technically impossible. She described Reinhardt as focused on a territorial solution to the Jewish question, never genocide. When the television miniseries Holocaust aired in Germany, generating intense public discussion, Lina criticized it for overlooking what she called the facts and the horrors of the camps, implying the focus on Jewish extermination was overblown. Her denialism was complete, unyielding, impervious to evidence or moral argument. For her children, this created an impossible situation. How do you reconcile a mother who loves you with a mother who denies atrocities? How do you process a father described as loving and kind when the world knows him as a monster? Each child handled it differently. Heydrich, the eldest surviving son, grew up knowing eventually he would have to confront who his father was. As a child, he was shielded from the full truth. Lina told him his father had been an important official, a security leader, someone respected and admired. But as Heydrich became an adult, he learned the reality. He read books and documents. He saw the evidence. He visited concentration camps in Germany and Poland, bearing witness to the machinery of death his father had helped design. Heydrich came to understand that he had to distinguish between his father as a private figure and as a public figure. He knew from his mother that Reinhardt had loved his children deeply, that he showed them affection, that in the domestic sphere he was capable of tenderness. But he also knew what Reinhardt had done professionally. This split, holding both truths simultaneously, defined Heydrich's adult life. Unlike his mother, he did not deny the Holocaust. Unlike some children of Nazis who publicly repudiated their parents, he did not completely disown his father. He existed in the uncomfortable middle, acknowledging the atrocities while maintaining that his father had loved him. In 2011, Heydrich made news when he offered to help the municipality of Panenské Břežany restore the castle where he had lived as a child. At 76 years old, he returned to the place where his family had spent the war, where his brother had died, where forced laborers had worked under his mother's cruelty. He met with the local mayor, Libor Holik, and offered to help find financing for the reconstruction of the dilapidated estate. He suggested seeking European Union funds. He envisioned the building becoming a museum or a memorial to Czech resistance. The response was explosive. Czech citizens were outraged. The idea that the son of the Butcher of Prague would involve himself in the castle's restoration felt like a profound insult to history. Heydrich insisted his intentions were good, that he simply wanted to see the building preserved, that he understood its importance as a historical site. The mayor defended him, noting that Heydrich had been only 7 years old when his father died, only 10 when the family fled. He argued for distinguishing the son from the father, but many Czechs could not or would not make that distinction. The Heydrich name carried too much weight, too much pain. Survivors and descendants of those murdered in the reprisals could not accept any Heydrich involvement with the site. Heydrich gave an interview to the Czech magazine Reflex during this controversy, sharing what his mother had told him about his father's final wishes. Lina claimed that Reinhard, before dying, had expressed hope that Germany would not carry out acts of revenge for his death. Heydrich relayed this, suggesting his father had tried to prevent the reprisals. But this contradicted everything known about Nazi policy and about Heydrich's own ruthlessness. Critics dismissed it as desperate mythology, a family attempting to soften the historical record. The castle proposal went nowhere. Heydrich returned to Germany, his gesture rejected. Silke and Marte maintained even lower profiles. Details of their adult lives remain scarce. They did not give interviews, did not seek publicity, did not engage in public controversies. They lived quietly, married, perhaps had families of their own, though even this is uncertain from available records. They chose anonymity, the path of least resistance for children of notorious figures. By keeping silent, by staying out of view, they avoided the judgment and the questions that inevitably followed the Heydrich name. Lina Heydrich died on August 14, 1985, on Fehmarn at the age of 74. She died unrepentant, having spent her entire widowhood defending Reinhardt's memory and denying his crimes. Her death passed without major notice. She was buried quietly, and no public memorials marked her passing. For her children, her death meant the end of the primary voice shaping their understanding of their father. They were finally free to construct their own relationships with that history. Though by then they were middle-aged, their views largely formed. The contrast between the Heydrich children's experience and that of other Nazi offspring is instructive. Some, like Nicholas Frank, son of Hans Frank, the Governor General of Poland, dedicated their lives to publicly condemning their fathers. Nicholas wrote extensively about his father's crimes, spoke at schools and universities about the Holocaust, used his surname as a teaching tool about complicity and evil. Others, like Gudrun Himmler, never wavered in defending their fathers, attending SS reunions, maintaining that their fathers had been good men unjustly vilified by history. The Heydrich children fell somewhere between these extremes, neither loudly defending nor openly condemning, choosing instead a kind of quiet acceptance mixed with private struggle. This middle position reflects perhaps the most common response among children of high-ranking Nazis. They were children during the regime, innocent of their parents' crimes, yet they inherited the guilt by association, the shame and ostracism that came with the family name. They grew up in post-war Germany, a society desperately trying to move forward while grappling with an unfathomable past. The question of how to remember, how to judge, how to assign responsibility remained contentious. Should children bear any blame for their parents' actions? Most would say no. But should they acknowledge those actions, express remorse, distance themselves? Opinion divided sharply. For the Heydrich children, their mother's pension lawsuit crystallized the moral complexity. They benefited financially from their father's position, receiving money that came indirectly from his service as an architect of genocide. They had grown up in stolen property, a castle confiscated from a Jewish refugee. They were raised by forced labor. Yet they were children when all this occurred, unable to choose or influence the circumstances of their upbringing. How should society treat them? With compassion for their impossible inheritance? With judgment for continuing to benefit from atrocity? There were no easy answers. The acceleration of Holocaust education and remembrance in later decades put additional pressure on families like the Heydrichs. As Germany built memorials, established museums, introduced comprehensive teaching about Nazi crimes, the descendants of perpetrators faced renewed scrutiny. Some engaged actively with memory work, participating in educational programs, speaking about their family histories to prevent repetition. Others retreated further into privacy, overwhelmed by the weight of expectation and judgment. The Heydrich children largely chose the latter path, perhaps because their mother's vocal denialism had created an environment where honest reckoning felt impossible. Heydrich's 2011 attempt to engage with the castle represented a rare moment of public involvement, and its rejection demonstrated the limits of reconciliation. Czech society, still bearing deep scars from occupation and reprisal, was not ready to accept a Heydrich in any positive role related to that history. The very suggestion felt like an erasure of suffering, a normalization of what should never be normalized. Heydrich's apparent good intentions mattered little against the enormity of what his father had done. Today, the Heydrich name remains one of the most notorious in history. Reinhard is remembered as one of the principal architects of the Holocaust, the man who chaired the Wannsee Conference where the final solution was formalized, the brutal protector who terrorized occupied Czechoslovakia. His assassination, one of only 2 successful Allied operations against high-ranking Nazis, remains legendary. The reprisals that followed stand as testament to Nazi savagery, and his children, now elderly or deceased, remain footnotes to this larger history, people whose lives were defined by circumstances completely beyond their control. The surviving Heydrich children and grandchildren keep a low profile. They have not sought to rehabilitate Reinhard's name in the way that some Nazi descendants have attempted. They have not become prominent figures in neo-Nazi movements or Holocaust denial circles, but neither have they become voices for remembrance and education in the way some descendants of perpetrators have. They exist in the shadows of history, carrying a burden they did nothing to earn, navigating a world that will always associate their surname with unimaginable evil. Lina's pension, awarded by courts prioritizing legal technicality over moral consideration, continued until her death and symbolized a broader failure of post-war justice. While some Nazis faced trials and punishment, many others were quietly reintegrated, their crimes overlooked or minimized. The pensioning of Nazi widows and orphans, even when those Nazis had commanded death camps and organized genocide, revealed how incomplete denazification truly was. Economic and political considerations often trumped moral ones. Germany needed to rebuild, needed workers and civil servants, and that meant looking forward rather than dwelling too much on the past. The Heydrich children grew up in this contradictory environment, where their father's crimes were simultaneously acknowledged and elided, where they were both pariahs and normal citizens, where they could collect pensions while survivors struggled. This duality shaped their choices and their silence. Speaking out risked public condemnation. Remaining silent risked accusations of complicity. There was no winning move, no position that would satisfy both their own need for identity and society's need for accountability. Their story, like those of other Nazi descendants, raises profound questions about inherited guilt, collective memory, and the possibility of redemption. Can the children of monsters escape their father's shadows? Should they be expected to publicly repudiate people they knew as loving parents? How do we balance compassion for individuals with the demands of historical justice? These questions have no single answer. They depend on context, on the specific actions of specific people, on the willingness to engage honestly with the past. The Heydrich children's relative silence suggests they chose to protect themselves rather than engage in the painful work of public reckoning. This is understandable, perhaps even inevitable, given the magnitude of their father's crimes and their mother's lifetime of denial. But it also means they did not contribute significantly to the ongoing process of remembrance and education. They did not help future generations understand how ordinary people can participate in extraordinary evil. They did not offer insights into the banality and bureaucracy that enabled genocide. They simply tried to live their lives as normally as possible, which itself is a kind of statement about what they owed and to whom. Reinhard Heydrich's legacy is one of calculated cruelty and systematic murder. His children's legacy is one of silence and survival, of trying to build lives on foundations of horror. Their story reminds us that history does not end with the perpetrators, that the ripples of atrocity spread across generations, affecting innocent people in ways both profound and subtle. It also reminds us that justice is complicated, that legal systems can fail moral tests, that healing requires more than trials and sentences. The Heydrich children lived through all of this, caught between their mother's mythology and history's verdict, between private memory and public knowledge, between who they might have been and who their father's actions forced them to become.